The rain had been falling since morning, and by the time Maya Santos reached the iron gate of the Hartwell estate, her coat was soaked through to the skin, and her boots had stopped keeping out water 2 miles back. She had walked those 2 miles from the overpass, where she had been sleeping for the past 11 days, carrying everything she owned in a canvas bag that had once been her mother's. A change of clothes, a small photograph, a worn nursing textbook with highlighted pages, and a sealed envelope she had never been able to bring herself to open, let alone deliver. She stood at the gate for a long moment. The estate stretched beyond the iron bars, like something from another world. A wide gravel driveway lined with old oak trees, a stone fountain at its center that had been turned off for the season, and at the end of it all, a manor house of pale limestone with tall windows, dark from the inside. It looked like a place where joy had lived once and simply forgotten to come back. Maya was 26 years old. She did not look it anymore. Months of sleeping in shelters that were always full, of eating whatever community kitchens offered, of carrying a weight no one around her could see, the weight of a promise she had not kept, had made her eyes older than her face. She raised her hand and pressed the buzzer beside the gate. She pressed it once, waited, and pressed it again. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The voice that crackled through the intercom was sharp and immediately suspicious. So it belonged to a woman, not a young woman. The voice of someone who had spent a long time deciding who was worth speaking to and who was not. The voice said that deliveries went around the back, and that whoever this was should go around the back. Maya did not go around the back. She pressed the buzzer a 3rd time. There was a long silence, and then the front door of the manor opened. A woman appeared on the top step of the entrance. Tall, in a charcoal blazer, her silver-streaked hair pulled into a severe knot. She looked down the driveway at the figure standing at the gate in the rain, with the expression of someone encountering something distasteful on the sole of a good shoe. This was Judith Hartwell, older sister of the man who owned the estate, and a woman who had positioned herself so thoroughly at the center of this household over the past 8 months that she had nearly forgotten she did not actually live here. She had moved in the week her sister-in-law Claire died, and she had not moved out since. Judith descended the steps and walked down the driveway with brisk, proprietary steps. She stopped on her side of the gate and looked at Maya the way certain people look at inconveniences, not with cruelty exactly, but with an economy of regard that is its own kind of cruelty. "What is it you want?" Judith asked. Maya met her eyes without looking away. She spoke clearly, without apology in her voice, but without aggression either. The voice of someone who had rehearsed this moment 100 times in the dark of the overpass and had decided that dignity was the only thing she had left that no one could take from her. She said she was looking for work. She said she had experience caring for households, caring for children, basic nursing and first aid. She said she was not asking for pay. She said if whoever owned this house would allow her to stay, somewhere warm, anywhere warm, she would work from before sunrise until after dark and would not ask for a single dollar in return. Judith stared at her. The rain fell between them in a gray curtain. "You are homeless," Judith said. It was not a question. "Yes," Maya said. "And you expect us to let you inside our home?" "I expect nothing," Maya replied. "I'm asking." Judith opened her mouth to send her away. She was very good at sending people away. It was, in many respects, the skill she had most refined in 8 months of managing this household and this family. But at that exact moment, something happened that Judith had not anticipated. The front door of the manor opened again, and a small figure appeared at the top of the entrance steps. A little girl, 5 years old, in a white nightgown that was too thin for the cold air rushing through the open door. She stood there with bare feet on the stone step, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, staring down the driveway with enormous, unreadable eyes. "Grace," Judith called out sharply, "go back inside." The child did not move. "Grace," I said, "go inside." "Oh." Judith's voice was controlled, but carrying the particular edge of someone who is accustomed to being obeyed by everyone in a house, and has never quite managed to extend that authority to a 5-year-old. The little girl remained where she was. She was looking at Maya, not at Judith, not at the gate, not at the rain. She was looking directly at the woman standing on the other side of the iron bars, and she was looking with the focused, eerily perceptive attention that only very young children and very old people seem capable of, as if she could see something the rest of the world had decided not to look at. Maya looked back at her. Something shifted in Maya's expression. Not pity, never pity. Something softer and more specific. She had seen that look before. She knew what it meant to be a child, standing in a doorway, wondering where the warmth had gone. Then a second figure appeared in the doorway behind the child. A man, tall, in a dark sweater, with the sleeves pushed to his elbows, his hair disheveled in the way of someone who had not slept properly in a long time. He placed one hand on the little girl's shoulder, looked down the driveway toward the gate, and stood there for a moment in silence. This was Daniel Hartwell. He was 40 years old, and he looked, in that moment, every year of it, and then some. He had the build of a man who had once been physically present in the world, in his body, in his space, in the rooms he occupied, and had somewhere along the way retreated from that presence, leaving behind only the outline of it. His company had designed buildings across 4 states. His name was on a foundation that funded children's hospitals. He had been, by every account that anyone who knew him before would give you, a man of warmth and decisive energy, the kind of man who walked into a room and made it feel inhabited. Claire had died 8 months ago, and Daniel Hartwell had not yet found his way back into any room. He looked at the gate. He looked at the woman standing in the rain. Then he looked at his daughter, who was still watching the gate with those steady, solemn eyes. He said, "Judith, who is that?" Judith turned away from the gate to face him. She said it was no one. She said it was someone asking for work, a homeless woman, and that she had been about to send her on her way. Daniel stood for a moment longer, looking down the driveway. He could not have seen Maya's face clearly from that distance, and in that rain. He could not have seen the canvas bag, or the soaked coat, or the particular quality of stillness she carried, the stillness of someone who has stopped waiting to be saved and is simply, quietly, determinedly surviving. He saw only a figure at his gate in the rain. He said, "Let her in." Judith turned back to face him fully. She said, "Daniel." He said, "Let her in, Judith. It's raining." And that was all he said. He put his hand on Grace's shoulder again and turned her gently back into the house. Judith stood at the gate for a moment longer, with the expression of someone swallowing something unpleasant. Then she pressed the release on the gate latch, and the iron bars swung open. Maya walked up the driveway. She walked without rushing, without visibly exhaling the breath she had been holding for 2 miles, without allowing the relief to show on her face, because she had learned, the hard way, the only way one learns such things, that relief has a tendency to arrive too early and end very badly. She walked steadily up the gravel drive, past the silent fountain, past the skeletal oak trees with their November branches, and she climbed the steps of a house that was not hers, and entered it not knowing yet that she would never truly leave it. The interior of the Hartwell manor was a place that had once been carefully loved and was now being carefully maintained. And those are two entirely different things. The entry hall had high ceilings and wide wooden floors polished to a cool shine. A staircase curved upward to the left. On the walls hung artwork that spoke of a particular kind of considered taste. Not showy, not cold, but the selections of someone who had looked at things slowly and chosen only what genuinely moved her. Claire's choices, all of them, though Maya did not know that yet. The hallway smelled faintly of wood polish, and underneath it, something that had the character of absence, the way a house smells when the person whose warmth organized it is no longer present. Judith led Maya to the kitchen without warmth or ceremony and told her to sit. She set a mug of hot water on the table, not tea, not coffee, just hot water, and remained standing with her arms folded across her blazer as Maya sat in a wooden chair and tried not to show how badly her hands were shaking. Daniel came into the kitchen a few minutes later. He sat across the table from Maya and looked at her in the direct, but unaffected way of someone who has lost the energy for social performance. He asked her name. She told him. He asked where she had come from. She told him she had been staying under the Route 9 overpass. He did not react to this with discomfort or with performance of sympathy. He simply nodded, as though she had told him the weather. He asked what kind of experience she had. Maya told him. 2 years of nursing school before she had to withdraw. 18 months of caregiving for her mother during a long illness. Cooking, administering medications, managing doctor's appointments, cleaning, organizing. Before that, she had worked part-time in a hotel laundry, a school cafeteria, and one summer in a greenhouse. She could cook. She could clean. She knew how to take a blood pressure reading and recognize the signs of a fever in a child. And she said all of this in the same measured, careful way she had stood at the gate, without begging, without embellishment, without shrinking. Judith, from her position against the counter, said that this was all very well, but that they had adequate staff, and that she herself managed the household, and that there was really no need. Daniel said, "Why did you leave nursing school?" The question landed quietly in the room. Maya looked at him. He was watching her with an attention that was not hostile and not particularly warm. The attention of a man trying to understand something in the simplest, most direct way available to him. She said, "My mother was sick. There was no one else." He said, "And your mother?" "She passed," Maya said. 8 months ago. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Daniel was looking at the table. Then he looked back up at her, and his eyes held something that was not quite recognition but was adjacent to it. The particular awareness of one grieving person encountering another. He said, "You can stay in the room above the garage. There's a bed and a bathroom. The heating works." He said she could start in the morning, that he would expect honesty and reliability, and that he would not have his daughter frightened or confused by strangers, and that if either of those conditions were not met, she would leave immediately and without discussion. Maya said, "I understand." He stood, said good night, and left the kitchen. Judith followed him, and as she passed Maya's chair, she stopped for just a moment. A brief pause, did almost nothing, and said in a voice low enough that it would not carry beyond the kitchen that this arrangement would not last, and that she was not to get comfortable. Maya said nothing. She finished the hot water, which was not tea and not coffee, and was still the warmest thing she had touched in 11 days, and sat for a moment in the silence of the kitchen with her mother's canvas bag at her feet. Inside that bag, among the worn textbook and the photograph and the change of clothes, was the envelope. She had not let herself think about it while she walked those 2 miles. She had not let herself think about it while she stood at the gate in the rain. She thought about it now, for exactly 3 seconds, the weight of it, the fact of it, the thing it contained. And then she stood up, picked up the bag, and went to find the room above the garage. The room was small. The bed had a gray blanket folded at its foot, and a pillow that had been there a while. The window looked out over the back of the estate, a kitchen garden gone to seed for the season, and beyond it, a stand of pine trees that disappeared into the dark. The heater on the wall clicked twice when she turned it on, and then began, faithfully, to produce warmth. Maya sat on the edge of the bed. She peeled off her wet socks and set them on the radiator. She took off the coat and draped it over the chair in the corner. She sat for a while in the warmth and the quiet, and she did something she had not allowed herself to do in a long time. She breathed. She took the envelope from the bag and placed it on the nightstand beside the lamp. She did not open it. She had not opened it in 8 months. She knew what was inside because the woman who had given it to her had told her, in a voice made thin by illness, but still precise with the particular clarity that comes to people near the end. The clarity of someone who has decided to say exactly what matters and nothing else. The woman had pressed the envelope into Maya's hands on a morning in March, in a hospice room with pale yellow curtains, and had asked her to give it to her husband, had asked her to make sure he understood. Maya had taken the envelope. She had said she would deliver it. And then everything had collapsed, her mother within the same week, the apartment, the job she had been holding, the last remaining structure of the life she had been building. And she had not delivered it. She had told herself she would find a way. And she had told herself she would find him when she had a phone number, when she had an address, when she was not sleeping in a shelter, when she was not so ashamed of what she had and had not done that she could barely hold the envelope without her hands shaking. She had found the address eventually, the way you find things when you have nothing else to do but think, a name in an online article about a foundation, a building permit filing, an estate outside the city registered to a D. Hartwell. She had told herself, walking those 2 miles in the rain, that she had come here for this, to give the letter and walk away. She had told herself it was simple. She looked at the envelope on the nightstand. She turned off the lamp and lay down in the dark. In the main house, at the end of a long corridor on the 2nd floor, Grace Hartwell lay in a bed, with stars painted on the ceiling, and a nightlight shaped like a moon on the wall. And she was not asleep. She was lying on her side looking at the window, where the rain was still running in thin lines down the glass. She thought about the woman at the gate. She thought about her eyes. She did not know why, but she felt certain, with the absolute, unfounded certainty of a child, that something had changed tonight, that the house was different in some way she did not have the words for yet. In the kitchen below, Judith stood at the counter with her phone pressed to her ear, speaking in a low and deliberate voice to someone who answered on the first ring. She said the situation was manageable. She said not to worry. She said she would handle it. And she said it the way people say things when they are not certain they are true. And the rain fell steadily over the Hartwell estate through the rest of that night, washing the gravel clean, running off the stone fountain, flattening the dead grass of the kitchen garden, and pooling in the dark earth beneath the pine trees, as if the world itself was clearing space for something that was about to begin. Maya was awake before the sky changed color. She dressed in the dark out of habit. Her mother had needed medication at 5 in the morning for the last 14 months of her life, and the body, once it has learned a kind of devotion, does not easily forget it. She pulled her hair back, folded the gray blanket at the foot of the bed, and stood for a moment in the center of the small room above the garage, looking at the envelope on the nightstand. She picked it up, placed it at the bottom of the canvas bag beneath the nursing textbook, and went downstairs into the main house. The kitchen was cold and dark. She found the light switches, found the coffee, found a cast iron pan on a hook above the stove, and eggs in the refrigerator and bread in a wooden box on the counter. She found pushed to the back of a cabinet, a small pot of oatmeal and a bag of brown sugar. And from these things, ordinary, modest things, she made breakfast. Not because anyone had asked her to. Not because it was on a list of duties. She made it because a house that has been running on grief needs, more than almost anything else, to smell like something warm in the morning. She was washing the pan when Judith came downstairs at 7:15. Judith appeared in the kitchen doorway in a silk blouse and reading glasses pushed up on her head, and stopped when she saw the table, set with plates and cups, a pot of coffee keeping warm on the stove, a rack of toast, a bowl of oatmeal with a folded cloth on the side. Judith's expression did not change exactly, but something moved across it. A small, involuntary recalibration, like a person adjusting their weight on uncertain ground. She asked who said you could use this kitchen. Maya turned from the sink. She said, "No one?" "I'm sorry if that was overstepping. I can clear it if you'd like." Judith looked at the table again. She said nothing. Grace appeared behind her mother's sister in the doorway, barefoot again, in the same white nightgown. Then she stopped when she saw Maya. She looked at the table. She looked at the oatmeal. She looked at Maya with those grave, enormous eyes, and she said nothing. This, Maya would come to understand, was Grace's natural state. She did not speak much, had not spoken much since her mother died, and the adults in the house had taken different approaches to this silence. Judith managed around it with cheerful directives and a kind of determined normality that the child seemed to see through without difficulty. Daniel held his daughter with a tenderness that was also a helplessness, the tenderness of a man who wants desperately to fix something and cannot locate the mechanism. Maya looked at the little girl and said, "Good morning." That was all. She did not force it. She did not crouch down to the child's level with exaggerated friendliness, the way adults do when they are performing warmth for an audience. She said good morning in the same direct, easy way she might say it to someone her own age. As a fact, an offering, nothing more than what it was. Grace looked at her for a moment longer. Then she walked to the table and climbed into a chair and pulled the oatmeal toward her. Judith watched this with an expression that was difficult to read. She poured herself coffee without sitting down and left. That first week inside the Hartwell house established the shape of things. Maya worked. She worked in the steady, unshowy way of someone who has spent years learning that the most useful thing you can do in a crisis, any crisis, large or small, is simply to handle what is directly in front of you. She cleaned methodically, not aggressively, taking care with the things that were clearly precious. A particular way Claire had arranged objects on a shelf, a child's drawing framed on the wall of the hallway, a set of blue glass bottles on the windowsill in the main sitting room. She did not rearrange. She did not impose. She cleaned around these things as if they were sacred, which to this house she understood without being told. They were. She cooked real meals for the first time in what the refrigerator and the pantry, when she examined them, suggested had been a very long time. The pantry stocked with expensive items that no one was combining into anything. Pre-made meals in the freezer, a vegetable drawer in the refrigerator containing things that had stopped being vegetables. And she made soup on the second day and a slow-cooked stew on the third. She made Grace a soft scrambled egg every morning with a piece of toast cut into soldiers. Not because Grace had asked, but because she had noticed the child eating very little and had remembered from nursing school a professor who said that the most important thing about feeding a grieving child is not the food itself, but the consistency of the offer. You do not force it. You simply make the offer the same way every day until one morning the child eats without thinking about it. On the fourth morning, Grace ate all the soldiers. Daniel noticed. He did not say anything directly, but Maya caught him watching from the kitchen doorway one morning as Grace finished her breakfast and slid from the chair and went to find her shoes. Unasked, unprompted, as if the simple act of eating had restored in her some small current of ordinary motivation. He watched his daughter walk down the hallway, and then he looked at Maya, who was washing the pan at the sink, and he said, "She used to eat like that." "Before?" Maya said, "She's starting to come back." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "How do you know?" She said, "Children move toward warmth the same way plants do. You just have to be consistent about where the warmth is." He looked at her in a way he had not looked at her before. Not with assessment now, not with the careful neutrality of a man evaluating whether he'd made a mistake, but with something more open than that. Something that was not quite gratitude, and not quite wonder, but was in the neighborhood of both. Then he said, "She hasn't spoken to me much this week." "I know," Maya said, "but she's been listening to everything. That's not nothing." He nodded and left the kitchen, and Maya turned back to the sink, and neither of them said any more about it. But the quality of the silence between them was different after that morning. Less careful, less provisional. The silence of two people who have discovered they are capable of a certain kind of honest exchange. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Judith watched all of this. She watched with the quiet, continuous attention of someone constructing a case. She found small things to criticize. The way Maya had reorganized the cleaning supplies under the sink, a window left unlatched, so a jacket Grace had worn outside that was not warm enough, as though Maya had chosen it. She raised these corrections in the mornings in front of Daniel, framed carefully as concern, and Daniel would listen and nod and forget them by afternoon, because the evidence in front of him each day was the evidence of a house that was beginning, slowly and cautiously, to function again. A daughter who was eating, a kitchen that smelled like something, floors that were clean, and beneath all of it, something he could not name but could feel, a quality of attention that had returned to the walls and windows of the place, as if someone had opened the rooms to the air. But Judith was patient. She was a woman who understood how to work on a long timeline. On the 9th day, she came to the room above the garage. Maya was sitting on the bed, reading the nursing textbook. She read it in the evenings the way someone else might read a novel, out of love for the thing itself, out of the stubborn fidelity to a future she still refused to stop believing in. She heard the knock, set the book down, and opened the door. Judith stood in the frame with her arms folded against the cold of the outside air, her silver hair catching the light from the room, her expression composed into something that was meant to look like concern. She said, "I want to be straightforward with you." Maya said, "All right." Judith said that she understood Maya's situation was difficult. She said she did not doubt that the woman was capable and hard-working. But she said that Daniel was in an extremely fragile state, that Grace was in an extremely fragile state, and that what this family did not need was additional disruption. Or, she paused here, selecting the word with precision, attachment. She said that it was one thing to employ a housekeeper, and another thing entirely to allow a situation to develop in which a child, who had already lost her mother, formed a dependency on someone who was, when you examined the facts plainly, a temporary presence, a stranger. Maya listened to all of this. She stood in the doorway of the small room, with the canvas bag on the floor behind her and the lamp on the nightstand, casting a warm circle of light. and she listened without interruption until Judith was finished. Then she said, "I'm not trying to replace anyone," Judith said. "Of course not." Maya said, "I'm trying to do the job I said I'd do." Judith looked at her for a moment. She said that was all she was asking. She said goodnight and walked back across the dark yard toward the main house, and her heels made a precise, deliberate sound on the gravel all the way to the door. Maya stood in the doorway after she had gone. She looked up at the sky, which was clear now. The rain from that first night long finished, and the stars were very sharp and close in the cold. She thought about the envelope. She thought about what it would mean to give it to him. She had rehearsed this many times in the long months of waiting. The way she would explain herself, how she came to have it, why it had taken so long. She had rehearsed the words until they had lost their meaning, the way a word loses its meaning if you say it too many times. She had imagined a formal moment, a deliberate moment, herself presentable, Anna composed, handing over the things she had been carrying, and then stepping back. She had not imagined any of this. This house, this child, this man watching from doorways. She had not imagined that delivering the letter would require her to be a person inside the story rather than a messenger arriving at the edge of it. She went inside. She did not take the envelope out of the bag. 3 weeks into her time at the estate, something shifted with Grace. It began in the kitchen garden. Maya had been out there on a Saturday morning assessing what might be salvaged for spring, pulling dead stalks, turning soil in one of the raised beds, finding, under the decay of the season, the faint suggestion of bulbs that had survived. Grace appeared at the garden gate in her coat and boots, dressed herself, which was new, and stood watching. Maya did not invite her in or wave her over. She kept working. After a few minutes, Grace pushed the gate open and came to stand beside the bed Maya was working in and looked at the dark earth. She said, "What are you doing?" Her voice was small and slightly rusty, like a door that hasn't been opened in a while. Maya did not stop what she was doing. She said she was looking for things that were still alive. She said sometimes things look finished on the outside, but if you get down close enough and look, there are roots still going. She said those were the ones worth saving. Grace looked at the turned earth. She crouched down and looked very closely in the way children do when they are genuinely interested, with her whole body, her nose nearly touching the soil. She said, "There's one." "There is," Maya agreed. "A good one." They worked together for an hour without speaking much. Grace pulled dead stalks when Maya showed her which ones. She carried them to the compost pile at the back of the garden in her small, gloved hands, with an expression of great seriousness. She asked several questions. Why do some plants die and some don't? Where do the roots go in winter? If you plant something, can you be sure it will come back? And Maya answered each one honestly, which is to say she answered some with certainty and some with, "I don't know, but I think," and this seemed to satisfy the child better than certainty alone would have. When they came inside, Grace's boots left a trail of dark soil across the kitchen floor. Maya looked at the trail. Then she got the mop. "Grace," without being asked, I went and got a cloth from the cabinet under the sink, the same cabinet Maya had reorganized on her second day, and wiped her boots on it, watching Maya's face to see if she had done it right. "You did it right," Maya said. Grace smiled. It was not a full smile, more like the draft of one, like a room that has just been opened and is still too cold for anyone to move into yet. But it was there, and Maya saw it and kept mopping and didn't make a thing of it, because some things are too delicate for attention. Daniel was standing in the hallway doorway when they came through. He had seen the boots, the cloth, the mop, the trail. He watched his daughter carry her boots to the mat by the door and set them down precisely, side by side. Grace looked up and saw him and said, "We found roots," he said. "Yeah?" She said, "Some things look dead, but they're not." He looked at Maya. Maya was hanging the mop up and had her back to both of them. He looked at his daughter again, and he said, "You're right about that, Grace. You're absolutely right." He said it in a voice that was barely holding. That night, Daniel knocked on the door of the room above the garage. Maya opened it to find him standing in the cold, with his hands in the pockets of a dark coat, and an expression that was trying to be casual and not quite managing it. He said he wanted to say thank you. He said he knew he hadn't been easy to work for. He hadn't been easy to be around, if he was being plain about it. And that he noticed what she was doing for his daughter, and he wanted her to know he noticed. Maya said, "She's a remarkable child." He said, "She's like her mother." The sentence arrived in the air between them and sat there, not awkwardly, just with the weight of what it was. Maya said, "She sounds like she was remarkable too." He said yes. He said Claire was... And then he stopped. He looked at the ground and then back up. He said, "She was the kind of person who made a room make sense. And when she left, none of the rooms made sense anymore." He said it simply, without theater, the way people speak when they are so tired of carrying something that they no longer have the energy to dress it up. Maya looked at him. She looked at him steadily, and with the attention that had been her one constant quality since she arrived, the kind of attention that does not flinch, that does not fill the space with reassurance or noise, that simply remains. She said, "I know something about that." He looked at her. He said, "Your mother." "Yes," she said. They stood for a moment in the cold in the doorway of the small room. Not in a way that was romantic or searching, in the way of two people who have recognized, without ceremony, that they are standing in the same territory, that the land of loss is the same land regardless of who you lost. He said goodnight. She said goodnight. He walked back across the gravel to the main house. Maya sat on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands, and stayed like that for a while. She thought about Claire, the pale yellow curtains of the hospice room, the thin hand pressing the envelope into hers, the voice that had said, "Please, please, make sure he understands." She thought about the 8 months she had spent not delivering it. She had told herself she was waiting for the right moment, but the truth, and she knew it was the truth, was that she had been afraid. Afraid of what it meant to walk into the grief of a stranger and say, "I was there. I was there at the end, and I kept something from you, and I am giving it to you now." She took the envelope out of the bag. She turned it over in her hands. The paper had softened slightly from being carried so long. It had taken on the particular texture of a thing that has been held too many times. Claire's handwriting was on the front, just his name. Daniel, written in the careful, slightly effortful hand of someone who was writing it while sick, who had taken the trouble to make it legible because legibility was a form of love. Maya set it on the nightstand. She looked at it for a long time. In the main house, a light was on in the study on the ground floor, and Daniel sat at his desk, with architectural drawings open in front of him that he wasn't looking at. And in the kitchen above the garage, visible through the pine trees, the lamp in the small window burned on. And somewhere between those two lights, in the cold dark of the November estate, the truth that had been traveling for 8 months was beginning, slowly and irreversibly, to find its way home. It was Judith who found the envelope. Not deliberately, or so she would later claim. She had come to the room above the garage to return a house key she said Maya had left in the kitchen door lock, which was a reasonable errand, and also, if you knew Judith, not entirely a coincidence. Maya was in the main house with Grace at the time, helping her with a school project, a pressed leaf collage that had expanded, far in the way of children's projects, well beyond its original scope, and now covered most of the kitchen table. Judith had knocked on the garage room door, found it unlocked, and stepped inside to leave the key on the table. She saw the envelope on the nightstand. She saw the name on it. She stood very still for a moment. Then she picked it up. She did not open it. Not that first time. Not right then. But she held it, and she looked at the handwriting, and she understood, with the precise and terrible intelligence of someone who has been watching carefully for 8 months, that whatever was inside this envelope was something that the woman in this house had been carrying since before she arrived. She put it down. She left the key on the table, and she left the room, and she walked back to the main house across the gravel with her arms folded against the cold, and she went straight to the study and stood in the doorway, looking at Daniel, who was still at his desk. She said, "I need to ask you something about the woman you hired." He looked up. She said, "Do you know anything about her? Her background, I mean, where she actually came from." He said, "I know enough," Judith said. "I don't think you do." And in the small room above the garage, the envelope sat on the nightstand, with Daniel's name on the front in his dead wife's careful handwriting, and the November wind moved through the pine trees behind the kitchen garden, and somewhere a long root, deep in the cold earth, was still growing. Judith did not move immediately, and that was the thing about her. She was not impulsive. She was a woman who had learned, through a long life of managing things from the margins of other people's lives, that timing was the only advantage available to someone who did not have the center. She waited 3 days. She let Maya continue her routines, let Grace continue eating her breakfast soldiers, let Daniel continue sitting a little closer to the edge of himself each evening, closer to something she could not name and did not like. On the 4th day, she made her move. She waited until Daniel was home from the city office, where he still kept 3 days a week of meetings, the minimum, his assistant had once told someone, the absolute floor of what was required to keep things from falling apart. She waited until Grace was upstairs in her room. She asked Daniel to come into the sitting room, and she closed the door, and she stood with her hands clasped in front of her, and her face arranged into the expression of someone who is about to say something painful for the benefit of someone they love. She said, "I have to tell you something about Maya." He sat in the armchair by the window. He said, "All right." Judith said she had been in the room above the garage, returning a key, she said, and something about the way she said it gave the sentence no room for question. She said she had seen an envelope on the nightstand. She described it precisely, the softened paper, the handwriting on the front. His name. She said she recognized the handwriting. Daniel went very still. Judith said she was not certain. She did not want to cause alarm, but she believed it was possible, more than possible, that the woman currently living in his home and caring for his daughter had been in possession of a letter written by Claire for an unknown length of time and had not given it to him. The sitting room was very quiet. The fire in the grate made small sounds. Daniel was looking at the middle distance, at nothing, with the expression of a man who has just felt the ground move under him in a way he cannot yet interpret. He said, "You're sure it was her handwriting?" Judith said she believed so. She said she was sorry. She said she knew this was a great deal to absorb, and that she had not wanted to say anything without being certain, but that she could not in good conscience remain silent. What she did not say, what she had not said, and would not say, was that she had spent those 4 days researching Maya Santos with the focused efficiency of someone who has means and motivation. She had called a contact at a private firm she had used before for background inquiries. She had confirmed that Maya had withdrawn from nursing school 2 years prior. She had confirmed that Maya's mother had died 8 months ago. She had confirmed that Maya's mother had been a patient for 6 weeks at the same hospice facility where Claire Hartwell had died. The same facility. The same 6-week window. She had connected these facts like beads on a string, and she had held them in her hands for 4 days, deciding how to use them. What Judith had calculated, and she wasn't wrong exactly, only incomplete, was that the revelation of the letter would look, unto Daniel in his raw and exhausted state, like a betrayal. That a woman who had come to his house carrying a piece of his dead wife and had not immediately given it to him would look, at first, like a woman with an agenda, like a woman who had chosen her moment. Like, in short, exactly the kind of disruption Judith had been warning him about from the beginning. She had not calculated grace. Daniel stood up. He said he needed to speak to Maya. Judith said she understood, that she would be here, that she was here for whatever he needed. He walked out of the sitting room and through the house and across the gravel yard, and he knocked on the door of the room above the garage with a knock that was controlled, and gave nothing away. Maya opened the door. She looked at his face, and she knew, not the specifics. She did not know about the 4 days of research or the private inquiry, but she knew the quality of what she was seeing on his face, because it was the face of someone who has just been handed information and has not yet decided what to do with the pain of it. She stepped back from the door. She said, "Come in." He came inside. He stood in the center of the small room, and he looked at the nightstand. The envelope was there. It had not moved in 4 days. She had not moved it, had been unable to move it, had spent 4 days circling toward a moment she could not seem to reach. He said, "Is that from Claire?" Maya said, "Yes," he said. "How long have you had it?" She did not look away from him. She said, 8 months. She said it plainly, without cushioning, because he deserved the plain version. The muscle in his jaw moved. He said, "You knew her?" Maya said, and this is the moment that the story had been building towards since a woman in a rain-soaked coat stood at an iron gate and pressed a buzzer and waited. She said, "She was in the room next to my mother's, at the hospice, for the last 3 weeks of both of their lives." Daniel sat down on the edge of the bed, not because he chose to, because his legs made the decision before he did. Maya did not move from where she was standing near the door. She spoke quietly and without stopping, because she had been carrying this for 8 months, and she had rehearsed it 1,000 times, and now that the moment had arrived, she understood that the only way through it was straight. She said that her mother and Claire had been brought to neighboring rooms on the same day in late March. She said that in hospice, the walls between rooms are not always enough. You hear voices. You hear the particular silence of someone on the other side who is not asleep. She said her mother had been frightened at the end, and that she had spent most of every day in that room, and that Claire, in the room next door, had sometimes spoken through the wall. Small things at first. A comment about the quality of the light. A question about whether Maya's mother liked music. An observation about the way the nurses walked. Whether you could tell a kind one from a less kind one by the sound of their footsteps. She said that Claire was funny. That even at the end, she was funny in the precise, dry, exact way of someone who sees clearly and has decided to see clearly, right up until there is nothing left to see. And she said that in those 3 weeks the 2 women had spoken through the wall, and then, when they were each strong enough, in the common room, her mother in a wheelchair, and Claire in one beside her, the two of them talking with the ease of people who have no reason left to be anything other than honest. She said her mother had died on a Thursday morning. She said Claire had died on the following Monday. She said that on the Sunday, the day before the Monday, Claire had asked to see her, had pressed the envelope into her hands, had said, "Please give this to my husband," had said, "Please make sure he understands that I was not afraid, that I need him to know I was not afraid." Maya's voice did not break, but it changed. It became something quieter and more careful, the voice of someone handling something fragile. She said that the following week her own life had collapsed. The apartment, the money, the last remaining structure of things. She said she had told herself she would find a way to deliver it when she was on her feet again. She said that was true, and also that she had been afraid. She said she was sorry. She said she was deeply, genuinely sorry, and that there was no version of the explanation that made the 8 months acceptable, and that she was not asking him to find one. Daniel was looking at the floor. His hands were clasped between his knees, and he was looking at the floor with an expression that was pain and something else. Something working through the pain, trying to find its shape. He reached out without looking up and picked up the envelope from the nightstand. He held it for a long time. Then he opened it. Maya moved to the doorway and stood with her back to the room, looking out at the dark yard and the pine trees and the kitchen garden where the winter had settled over the raised beds. She looked at the place where she and Grace had found the roots still growing. She gave him the room and the privacy of it without being asked, because that was simply who she was. A woman who understood that some things need space to be felt in. She heard the sound of paper unfolding, then silence. Then, and she would remember this for the rest of her life, she heard, from behind her, a sound she had never heard from a grown man before. Not crying, exactly. Something before crying. The sound of a person on the edge of a very large feeling, trying to hold it and finding they cannot. She did not turn around. She stood at the doorway looking at the garden, and she let him have it. All of it. The 8 months of not knowing what his wife's last thoughts were. The weight of every morning he had woken up without that knowledge. The particular loneliness of grief that has a question at the center of it, that has never been answered. When it was quiet again, she heard him say her name. She turned. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, with the letter open in his hands, and his face was, there is no other word for it, undone. Not destroyed. Undone in the way of something that has been held too tightly for too long and has finally been allowed to release. His eyes were red, and his jaw was set against itself, and he looked at her with an expression that was grief and relief and something that the two of them, in that room, on that November night, I would have been hard-pressed to name. He said. She said. You sat with her. On the last night. Maya said. Yes. He said. She wasn't alone. Maya said. She wasn't alone. He pressed the letter against his chest with both hands, the way you press something you cannot afford to lose. And he closed his eyes, and Maya stood in the doorway of the small room and watched him hold the last words his wife had written, and she felt something in her own chest. Not relief, something older and deeper than relief. The feeling of a long-owed debt being paid, of a thing carried a great distance finally arriving where it was always meant to go. Judith had heard none of this, but she had watched from the window of the sitting room as the light in the garage room stayed on, and she had waited. And when Daniel had still not returned after 40 minutes, she had gone upstairs and found Grace's room empty. Grace was not in her bed, not in the bathroom, not in the hallway. and had felt the first cold draft of genuine alarm. Grace was in the garage room. She had come down the back stairs and across the yard in her socks and her nightgown, in the cold, without anyone seeing her, because a 5-year-old who is determined to go somewhere is a force of nature that locks and closed doors can only slow. She had pushed the garage room door open. Maya had left it ajar and had stood in the entrance and had seen her father sitting on the bed with his eyes closed and something pressed to his chest, and Maya standing a few feet away watching him. Grace looked at her father. She looked at Maya. She walked across the room without hesitation, and she climbed onto the bed, and she put both her small arms around her father's arm, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and she stayed there. Daniel opened his eyes. He looked down at his daughter, this child who had barely spoken in 8 months, who had stood in doorways watching the world like someone deciding whether it was safe to re-enter. And he put his arm around her and pulled her close, and he held her the way you hold something you are grateful beyond words to still have. Grace looked up at Maya. She said, "Are you staying?" The question was simple. It was the question of a 5-year-old who has had enough of people leaving and would like, if at all possible, for things to stay where they are. It was also, and Maya felt this with a fullness that she had no defense against, the most important question anyone had asked her in a very long time. She looked at Daniel. He was looking at her over the top of his daughter's head. He was not asking her with the particular careful look of a man aware of what he was asking. He was simply looking at her, the way you look at something you have recently discovered you cannot imagine doing without. Maya said to Grace. She said it to Grace, not to anyone else, looking at the child's steady eyes. She said, "I'm not going anywhere." The confrontation with Judith came the following morning. It was not dramatic. It was, in the way of all real confrontations, much quieter than it should have been. Daniel came to breakfast early. Grace was already at the table with her soldiers. Maya was at the stove. Judith came downstairs at her usual time and found this arrangement, which was the same arrangement that had existed for nearly a month now, and understood at once from Daniel's face that the previous night had not gone the way she had intended. Daniel told her, without raising his voice, that he had spoken with Maya, that he understood the full picture now, that he was grateful she had brought the matter to his attention, and that the matter was resolved. Judith said, "Daniel, I only..." He said, "I know." He said it without anger, which was worse than anger. He said he knew she had been trying to protect the family, and that he understood. That was where it came from. He said that going forward, decisions about this household and the people in it were his to make. He said he would appreciate it if she extended Maya the same respect she would extend anyone he trusted. Judith looked at Maya. Maya was at the stove, not looking at either of them, giving the scene the same quiet space she gave everything, neither pressing her advantage nor pretending she wasn't there. Judith said nothing more. She sat down. She accepted the coffee that Maya set in front of her, because Maya set it in front of her anyway, without being asked, without theater, without the satisfaction of withholding a small kindness. And she drank it in silence. She left that afternoon with her bags. She did not make an announcement. She simply packed and left, and sent Daniel a text from the road saying she needed some time, and that she hoped he understood. He replied that he did, and that he hoped she was well. Anna Grace watched her aunt's car go from the window of the sitting room. Then she turned to Maya and said, "Can we go check the garden?" They went to check the garden. The weeks that followed were the closest thing to quiet that the Hartwell house had known in a long time. Daniel returned, incrementally and without fanfare, to being present inside his own life. Not because the grief had ended. Grief does not end. But because the question at the center of it had been answered. He knew Claire had not been alone. He knew she had not been afraid. He knew the last thing she had written was not a list of regrets, but a letter full of everything she needed him to understand, everything she needed him to carry forward. And he carried it now not as a weight, but as the thing it was always intended to be. He hired a contractor to rebuild the kitchen garden properly, not for practical reasons, as an offering, because he understood now that something important had happened in that dirt. He enrolled Grace in a program at a local school for 3 mornings a week. The therapist there said she was doing remarkably well, that she had the internal resources of a child who had been shown, consistently and persistently, that the world was safe enough to step back into. Daniel looked at Maya when the therapist said this, and Maya was looking at her hands in her lap with the slight smile of someone who does not take credit for things. He asked her, on an evening in January, when Grace was in bed and the kitchen was clean and the house was warm, whether she had ever thought about going back to finish her degree. She said she thought about it often, and he said, "Would you? If the situation made it possible." She looked at him. She said, "What situation?" He said, "This one." He said he was aware it was unconventional, and that he was also aware she could tell him it was none of his concern. He said that was her right, and he would accept it. But he said he had been thinking about what it meant that Claire had trusted her, a stranger, a young woman in a hospice corridor, with the most important letter she ever wrote. He said it was not a coincidence that the woman Claire trusted had been the same woman to appear at his gate in the rain. He said he did not know exactly what to call that, but that he knew it was something he didn't want to turn away from. Maya was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "She told me something else. Your wife. She said it through the wall one night when my mother was sleeping. She said she used to lie awake worrying that Daniel would close himself off, that he would take the grief and use it to build walls instead of doors. She said she needed me to tell him that." She stopped. She said, "I didn't put that in the letter. I kept that part. I told myself it wasn't mine to deliver. But I've been thinking. I think she meant me to say it to you directly. I think that was the plan all along." Daniel was looking at her with the full, unguarded attention of a man who has stopped protecting himself from something. She said, "You're not closed off anymore." He said, "No, not anymore." Outside the kitchen window, the January sky was a deep and serious blue, the kind that comes just before the light fades entirely, and the kitchen garden was a dark geometry of raised beds and bare soil against the snow. And somewhere down there in the cold, protected by the earth, the roots were still growing. Grace's voice came from the top of the stairs, not frightened, not urgent, just the ordinary nighttime voice of a child who has woken up and wants to know if someone is still there. Maya stood up. She called back up the stairs. "I'm here, Grace. Go back to sleep." There was a pause. Then the small voice said, "Okay, just that, simply and completely." And that was enough. The light in the kitchen stayed on for a long time that night. And if you had stood outside in the cold and looked through the window, you would have seen a man and a woman sitting at a kitchen table with their hands almost touching, talking in the easy, unhurried way of people who have stopped performing and started simply being, who have looked at the hard and complicated things between them and chosen, in spite of everything, to stay. Somewhere a few miles away, pressed inside a nursing textbook in a canvas bag that had once been a woman's whole world, a letter had been delivered. A promise had been kept. And the woman who had kept it was warm and not alone, and slowly, the way the best things grow, beginning at last to be home. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.